Some scientists and geologists have suggested renaming our era as the Anthropocene. Like the Holocene, the near recent geological period, the Anthropocene is suggested as the name for a new epoch in the history of the Earth. An epoch in which human influence on a global scale is so deep that it's visible in the geological record. Things like the transfer of pollen from the New World to the Old World. Things like growing carbon concentrations in the atmosphere. These can be recorded in the ice cores, in the geological record. And the idea of naming our era the Anthropocene is an idea about the profound impact that the human species, we'll question that agency in a minute, is bringing to the natural environment. But what does the Anthropocene bode for us? What can we expect? On the one hand, these extremely rich, totally managed environments which dry up the sea, desalinate water, air condition, and bring artificiality into every corner of life. On the other hand, effects of climate change most prominently that are coming to be felt around the world, especially in poorer countries, like with the increased frequency and intensity of tropical storms, but also in the first world, like with these forest fires in California, which, as you know, is now experiencing a terrible drought. What does the Anthropocene bode for us? What kind of processes can we expect to continue to take place and accelerate during our lifetime and the lifetime of our children? Let's do a short mental experiment. Imagine civilization only 50 years from now. You will all quite probably be around, me, certain chance. What kind of world do you see around you? Take a few seconds to imagine the landscape, the cityscape, the society. 50 years is a long time for an accelerating culture. Do you expect the world around you to look like this? Flying cars, technology having eradicated poverty, perhaps colonizing the solar system? Or is the picture in your head more similar to this? Overgrown decay, instability, and collapse. In the other way of asking this, is the Anthropocene a new beginning or the beginning of the end? This is why my task is difficult today. It's a TEDx talk. I'm supposed to stand in front of you and inspire you. But where in all of this inspiration industry is the place of a sober view of what we might expect in our generation and in future ones? How do we wrest inspiration and hope when we must project ourselves into a future that is always already toxic and at different stages of decay and collapse? In order to begin answering that question, we need to go beyond events and apply systems thinking. What kind of trends point us towards this kind of prognosis? What are the causes that we may attribute to the processes that we are already seeing around us? Because if, as I suspect, that picture of decay resonates with you more than that picture of technological exuberance, then we may be onto something here. We may have stumbled upon the great public secret of our time. What everybody knows, what it's in the back of everybody's mind, but what very few are prepared to talk about. The Anthropocene does not mark an era of continued acceleration. The Anthropocene marks the very bumpy and crisis-ridden collision between the route that human industrial civilization has taken and the limitations of the single planet that we inhabit. In a recent paper, commentators on the Anthropocene have called it the great acceleration, bringing together various trends and patterns, population, growth in GDP, foreign investment, energy use, we'll come back to that in a minute, the urban population, fertilizer consumption. One time after another, we see these J-shaped curves, these curves of acceleration. We see them in all socioeconomic trends worth mentioning: water use, telecommunication, transportation, international tourism. Everything is going there. That's not the only thing that shows us trends of growth and acceleration. Earth system trends are also following similar patterns, and these are a bit more foreboding. Carbon dioxide, the resultant surface temperature, methane, another greenhouse gas, acidification of the oceans, terrestrial biosphere degradation, marine fish capture, the loss of species. All of these are also following these accelerating curves. How do we make sense of this? Can a civilization based on perpetual growth survive on a single planet? I think the big public secret is that everybody knows the negative answer to that question. In other words, what goes up must come down. And we are the generation, or the couple of generations, who occupy this unique place in human history where we literally stand at the peak, or very close to the peak, of technological development. And I think this realization, the realization that we cannot anticipate an accelerating trend to continue indefinitely, the understanding that we are running up against the carrying capacity of this planet, is something that casts a long shadow over our inspiration, over our dreams for the future. We may want to think about things in completely personal ways. We may wish to remain in denial and place our hope in talent and technology to create a tomorrow where we will continue to enjoy this exuberance. But it takes a lot of ignorance or arrogance or denial to close our eyes to this. And so if we are expecting, within the coming century or two, this long protracted but crisis-ridden and irreversible process of decay of industrial civilization, where do we find hope? How do we wrest hope in times of collapse? Let's just understand why all this is happening and what those base causes are. The basic idea here is that most of our societies consume at above the carrying capacity of our planet. And here we see this differentiated between high-income countries, the blue line on top, and those low-income countries. China, as you see, because of its accelerated growth, has its own graph. And all of these are consuming in relation to a declining biocapacity. How is it possible? How is it possible for a society to exist on average about three times as much land that is required? This seems a bit of a paradox. How is it possible that we are being told that we are consuming 3 Earths? Where are those other 2 Earths? Here's the answer. This is basically what fills the gap between the US, for example, ecological footprint, which is, as you see, pretty equivalent to this top line, and the biocapacity. Most of it is filled by carbon. Where is that Earth? Those second and third Earths that we are living off, they're in the past. Those are the trees that have become carbon. Those are the organisms that have spent a long time, millions of years, in the Earth to become oil. We are effectively consuming this ghost acreage, right? Primary production, solar photosynthesis that happened millions of years before human beings developed into the species that we are. This is where it's coming from. And we can see indeed that along with those J curves is the J curve of consumption of fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, petroleum. Short of a discovery of something like cold fusion, I'm not holding my breath, this will go down as it went up. Most prognoses talk about having already passed the peak point of global oil production. Some capacity still remains. Extreme energy, this is the whole story on fracking right now. Okay? All a scramble to sustain the levels of input of cheap energy that are necessary to maintain industrial capitalism on its track. This is not going to last. This is the basic dynamic. It's a dynamic of overshoot. Any biologist, population scientist, ecologist will be able to explain this. I'll try to do it myself as well. Essentially, exceeding the carrying capacity does two things. First of all, it inevitably ends in a collapse. And this is on the level of a single population of any species or on the level of our global civilization. Secondly, the carrying capacity itself also degrades because we are living off the fund rather than off the interest. No matter what happens in the coming couple of generations, century or two, short of a science fiction level discovery of a source of infinite energy, we will end up returning to consume below or at the carrying capacity, now degraded. Yes, it will be more costly. Yes, we are facing a world in which a majority of living people will be occupied in primary production. We are talking about a decay and eventual reversal of many of the processes associated with globalization, which depend again on the availability of a constant supply of cheap energy. Where do we find inspiration in such a situation? How do we project ourselves with hope into a future that is characterized by technological decline? I think I have one answer to this. First of all, we have to face up to reality. What we in our old age and the coming generations are about to face is nothing new. It's new in terms of happening on a global scale, but it's not new in terms of a pattern of complexity being interrupted by collapse. It's happened to many civilizations before. On the bottom right, you can see the site of Eridu, the first city. The Sumerian civilization did not collapse because of conquest. It collapsed because canal irrigation and evaporation created ground salination. The earth became saline and could not be farmed anymore. And today, the desert has taken over. Easter Island, the Maya civilization, Viking Greenland, all examples, as Jared Diamond has pointed out, of societies that overused their natural resources and ending up transforming their environment to a more simple level that did not allow them to sustain their ways of life. Why should we expect our global civilization to meet any different fate? Well, the answer is that it won't. And most of us recognize that on some level and spend a lot of mental energy staying in denial about it. The question, however, is this: what kind of society will see us through the inevitable descent from the peak of the Anthropocene? Yes, we know that wherever we are in 200 years, we will live in a society that does not depend on perpetual growth for its existence. In other words, something other than capitalism. This model of a competitive economy, where each individual agent must grow perpetually in order to compete with others, and where the economy as a whole must grow perpetually in order to contain that competition and the financial crises that result. This is the teetering castle of cards which makes up our current capitalist civilization. It will not survive into a few generations. But the point is that what we receive instead might not be much nicer. The same factors that push social stratification in today's society are the ones pushing for unsustainable and perpetual growth. And we do face a divergence of paths right now. One is a path of business as usual. It's a path where consumption continues pretty much at current rates until it inevitably begins to decline, and where global elites engineer a peaceful transition away from perpetual growth into more local economies that are more self-sufficient, less harmful perhaps to the basic life support systems of the planet, but where nevertheless the basic hierarchical social relations of haves and have-nots are preserved. This is the question that is still worth asking. Are we prepared to go into this decline led by those policymakers, movers and shakers who sit in Davos and have created the mess that we are in? Or are we prepared to change society in a rather deep way that will allow the passage, the descent from this exuberant technological civilization into a more simple and local one, to be accompanied by more freedom, more equality, more solidarity, more mutual aid, and not less? We still have the capability to change the social course that this decline follows. Capitalism is overshot. Capitalism will collapse. Will we get new forms of feudalism instead, where growth is much slower, but where people are chained to other forms of economic enslavement through things like carbon credits, water credits? Or are we prepared to engage in a new politics of the commons? Because we know that global elites, governments, corporations will not deliver us anything but continued social stratification. They're just going to burn all that coal up till there's nothing left. And they're just going to keep concentrating that wealth until there's nothing left for the rest. Because all of this surplus population is not what they care about. We have to do it for ourselves. And there are components to what we can do which are directly inspired by the kind of society we want to see. If social struggles through the 20th century have taught us anything, it's that the only way to prevent efforts at changing a society from becoming exactly that which we fought against is for the movement for social change to prefigure, to anticipate in its own actions and its own structures the society that we want to create. And the fundamental point of such a society is that production is for need and not for profit. The perpetual growth that is necessitated by competition among private enterprises needs to be replaced by an economy that works in order to supply everyone's needs according to their own needs. And this implies new forms of ownership and management. Social ownership, workers' ownership, community ownership, and maximum grassroots democracy in the management of every area of life. This is not only a more just society, it is the only one, short of a new feudal order, that is compatible with a low throughput economy. Again, nothing like worker-managed factories or community-managed urban agriculture will be granted to us. The only way that we manage to return to an economy based on the commons, one that is sustainable in the long term, one that consumes at carrying capacity, is to seize those commons, to reclaim them ourselves. Whether it's taking city squares to form popular assemblies, whether it's occupying unused land to create urban farms, whether it's the attempt to take over bankrupt factories, school occupations, local initiatives, cooperatives, all of these attempts to eat away from the inside at a system that is unsustainable, at a system that is carrying us over the precipice, to eat away in order to create those different social forms, those parachutes or lifeboats, that as they grow will enable more and more of the population to take control of this process of decline and make sure that it is the interests of all rather than the interests of a few that are emphasized as we do so. And so, in projecting ourselves into a future of industrial decay, we do not need to lose hope. We do not need to sink into denial or despair, because we can still have a lot more freedom, a lot more equality, a lot more solidarity. While some of our levels of material consumption of technologies may go down, while we or our grandchildren, might need to spend much more time in primary production, growing food, taking care of our immediate environments, we can still do that with much more democracy, much more responsibility over our own lives. And I think that's a trade-off that we can still find a lot in to inspire us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uri, for that. As Uri said, we're in